The sound of tires screeching echoed through the quiet street, and before Devon Carter could even register what was happening, he saw it. His brother, Marcus, crumpling to the ground, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. "No," Devon screamed, but it was too late. The officers didn't hesitate, didn't wait for an explanation, they fired first. No weapon, no warning, just the heavy thud of a body hitting concrete. Marcus had done nothing wrong. He was just a kid, just a dreamer who had his whole life ahead of him. Devon ran toward him, his feet moving before his brain could catch up. But the moment he reached his brother's side, the sirens wailed in the distance, and the cops already had their story straight. Unarmed, unthreatening, innocent, the words the police would use to cover their tracks. They would claim it was a misunderstanding, call it justifiable, but Devon knew what this was. This was murder, and Devon Carter wasn't going to stand by and let his brother's life be forgotten like so many others. The system had failed them both. But Devon wouldn't wait for justice, he would become it. And over the next 72 hours, the world would tremble as one man, broken by grief but fueled by rage, took the law into his own hands. One by one, the officers who had taken Marcus's life would fall. No more apologies, no more empty promises. Just the cold, inevitable march of a man who had nothing left to lose. The evening air in southwest Atlanta had always been thick with humidity. The sun hung low, just beginning to disappear behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalks. The street was calm, like it always was at this hour, when people were getting ready to settle in for the night. Devon had just finished his shift at the office, the day's stress still weighing on his shoulders. When he saw Marcus step out of the house, he could never forget the way Marcus had looked that day. His brother always had that same, determined look in his eyes, as though the world couldn't touch him. Marcus was full of ambition, his mind always focused on his dream of escaping the harsh realities of their neighborhood. A strata student, a quiet achiever, the kind of kid you looked at and saw potential in, someone who would one day rise above all this. It had been just another normal evening when Marcus had walked out the door, looking for a few things from the corner store. It was 2 blocks down, a place they'd both been to 100 times, the kind of place where nothing ever went wrong. Devon knew this routine. He didn't worry when Marcus left, he'd done it 1,000 times. But this time, something was different, something wasn't right. Devon sat on the couch, his phone in hand, scrolling through some emails when he heard the first distant siren, then another and another. He shook it off, thinking it was nothing out of the ordinary, maybe some kid setting off fireworks, or a late-night call. The sirens continued for minutes, louder now, until he heard a thud against the front door. Before Devon could even get up to check, there was a frantic, quick rap against the door. He opened it, his stomach already turning. A neighbor stood there, her face pale, hands trembling. Devon, Devon, they shot him. At first it didn't register. His mind, still groggy from the workday, couldn't quite process the words. "Who?" he asked, voice flat, confused. "Marcus, they shot him." Devon felt a sudden pressure in his chest, his breath caught in his throat, the world blurred for a second. "What?" She grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with panic. "They shot him in the street. The cops, Devon, they shot him." His heart raced as he ran out the door, pushing past her and heading down the block. The familiar sight of the street he grew up on was now alien to him. The usual calm was gone, replaced by chaos. The flashing lights of police cruisers reflected off the buildings. A crowd was beginning to gather, their faces filled with shock, anger, and disbelief. Devon's legs carried him faster than his mind could keep up, and the closer he got, the more he saw. Yellow tape, officers everywhere. He pushed past the barriers, hearing a shout, but not listening. His eyes were fixed on the one thing that mattered. It wasn't until he reached the corner that he saw it. Marcus's body, sprawled on the ground, blood soaking the pavement, the only color left in the fading daylight. Devon's world shattered. He didn't scream. He couldn't. His mind was blank, his body paralyzed with a combination of disbelief and rage. Marcus, his baby brother, the kid he had raised like his own son after their parents had died. Marcus was gone, and it didn't make sense. He fell to his knees beside him, trying to reach for Marcus's hand, but the body was already cold, the final remnants of life slipping through his fingers. His Gatorade bottle, the one Marcus had been carrying, lay next to him, a sickeningly vivid splash of red mixing with the blood. Devon's hands trembled as he turned his brother's face toward him. The shock in Marcus's eyes was still there, frozen in place, but it wasn't fear, it was confusion. Marcus hadn't understood what was happening, hadn't known why the officer had pointed a gun at him and fired. He hadn't been given a chance to speak, to explain. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. Devon stood, his breath shallow, his vision blurry with rage. He looked around, seeing the officers standing nearby, some already beginning to cover the scene, others still focused on whatever they were saying into their radios. Devon's mind raced with thoughts of how they would justify this. The usual story. He could already hear the words in his head. He reached for his waistband. He was a threat. We had no choice. But Devon knew the truth. This was murder, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. The thought was clear now. There was no turning back. He wasn't going to cry. He wasn't going to plead for justice. He had tried that. It had gotten him nowhere. The system had failed him. And his brother. The moment he saw Marcus's body, he knew what had to be done. He wasn't going to wait for justice. He would bring it. Over the next few days, the city would hear of the bloodshed that followed, but this was only the beginning. Devon wasn't a man looking for vengeance in the heat of anger. No, Devon Carter was a man who had just made a choice, and that choice would haunt every officer who had ever sworn to protect the system that killed his brother. Devon wasn't just going to fight for his brother. He was going to bring the whole system down. Devon Carter had always been the kind of man who valued structure and responsibility. Where others saw just another day in a gritty Atlanta neighborhood, he saw an opportunity to rise above, to make something of himself, and to break free from the cycle of hardship that defined so many around him. Born to a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, Devon was determined to ensure that his younger brother Marcus would never know the struggles he faced growing up. The two had always been close, but it was more than just the bond of brothers. Devon had assumed a fatherly role after their father had walked out when Devon was only 8, leaving their mother to shoulder the burdens alone. The responsibility Devon felt for Marcus was immense, yet natural. He wanted better for Marcus, a life beyond the violence, the poverty, the ever-present threat of failure. So, Devon worked hard, putting himself through college, sacrificing his time, his energy, everything he had to create a life that would give Marcus the opportunities he never had. And he did it. Devon graduated with honors, a degree in business management from Georgia State, and soon landed a stable job at a logistics firm. He didn't make a fortune, but the paycheck was steady, and that was enough to keep the family afloat. He found a modest home in a quieter neighborhood, far from the streets where violence had claimed the lives of too many of their childhood friends. He even started a small family of his own, a wife, a daughter, and of course, Marcus still there, by his side, following in his footsteps with the same drive to build a future. His relationship with Marcus was built on trust and mutual respect. Marcus looked up to him not just as an older brother, but as the example of what could be accomplished through hard work and perseverance. Devon was his rock, his guide through life, someone he could always turn to for advice, support, and reassurance. They had dreams together. Marcus, though younger, already had a vision of becoming a computer engineer. He wanted to create software that would empower kids from neighborhoods like theirs, kids who often didn't have the chance to dream beyond the walls that confined them. Devon had heard Marcus talk about it for years. I'm going to build something that changes everything. I'm going to give kids like me the tools to break free, Marcus had said more than once, his voice filled with the kind of determination that only a teenager with big dreams could have. Devon believed in him, he always had. Their relationship was solid. They had their moments of friction, of course. Every older sibling knows the responsibility of guiding the younger ones, of keeping them out of trouble, but it was always balanced by the quiet confidence Devon had in Marcus's ability to make it, even when the neighborhood sometimes seemed like it would swallow them whole. Devon felt sure that Marcus had the potential to break free. He was just a kid, but Marcus had already started making waves in high school, a strata student, a star on the track team, and someone who had already begun securing college scholarships. Devon had watched him on the track, his little brother, running faster than he ever thought possible, chasing the kind of future he couldn't even dream of when he was his age. It was a future that had seemed so certain. Devon was proud, even in moments when he had to fight for their survival. He knew Marcus was going to make it. He was sure of it. But then, like a storm sweeping through a calm day, everything changed. The day Marcus died was a day that started like any other. Devon had worked late into the evening, and by the time Marcus left to run an errand at the corner store, Devon had just finished making dinner. He'd been planning on asking Marcus about his next track meet and about the plans for his college applications. There was no rush, no feeling that something would go wrong. It was just a typical evening near quick trip to grab some chips and a Gatorade for dinner. Devon had stayed at home, his mind occupied with small things, work deadlines, the bills, planning a family vacation in the spring. He'd just finished putting the last of the dishes away when he heard the sirens. The distant wail of emergency vehicles seemed commonplace at first, nothing that would make him think twice, but the sirens didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. Devon stood up, distracted, his mind already running through possibilities. Maybe there was an accident down the block, or someone was hurt, but it was never a real worry, until his phone rang. It was a call from their neighbor. "Devon, you need to get out here," the voice said. "They shot Marcus. He's not moving." The words hit Devon like a physical blow. His legs froze, his heart stopped. There was no way it could be Marcus. But it was. He rushed out the door without thinking, running into the street, eyes searching for any sign of his brother. The flashing blue and red lights filled the block, making the street look like a war zone. Officers were everywhere, their backs to him, blocking the view of the body, but he knew. He knew what had happened before the words even left the officer's mouth. When he reached the scene, Devon saw Marcus lying motionless on the ground, surrounded by yellow crime scene tape. The blood was already pooling around his body. The officers didn't seem to care. No one was offering help. Devon's gaze went straight to the Gatorade bottle that had fallen from Marcus's hand, still perfectly intact just like him, but now, the only thing it was holding was blood. Devon's hand shook as he kneeled next to his brother's body, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. There was nothing. The world spun around him, and his breath quickened. His body went cold. He couldn't speak. The anger surged in his chest, but it felt distant, too far away to reach. All that remained was confusion and a horrible realization. Brother was gone, and the world wouldn't stop for him. The police weren't concerned with answers. They weren't concerned with the truth. They didn't care about Marcus's future, about the dreams he carried with him. All they cared about was the story they would sell. A tragic mistake, a brief altercation, a young black man reaching for something. Devon knew the truth. His brother was unarmed. His brother had done nothing wrong, but now his brother's death would be reduced to nothing more than a statistic. Devon's heart shattered, but his mind was already racing. There was only one thing he could do. The world had failed Marcus. The law had failed him. The system had failed them both. And now, it was Devon's turn to rewrite the rules. The world seemed to stand still for Devon as he knelt beside Marcus, his fingers trembling as they hovered over his brother's still form. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the puddles in the street, dancing like some cruel reflection of a nightmare. Devon's heart was racing, his breath shallow as he tried to understand the impossible reality before him. "Marcus," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "Marcus, wake up." But Marcus didn't stir. His eyes were fixed and lifeless, staring into nothingness. The blood around his body had already begun to pool, the bright red stark against the gray concrete. Devon reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to find a pulse, but deep down, he already knew. There was nothing left. His brother, the boy he had promised to protect, the one he had worked so hard for, was gone. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, as though the weight of the moment was physically pressing down on him. His fists clenched at his sides, and the anger, the rage, that had been simmering just beneath the surface exploded to the forefront. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This wasn't just another case of mistaken identity or a cop feeling threatened. Devon's eyes turned toward the officers who stood off to the side, some with their arms crossed, others standing guard, their faces unreadable, as if they were simply waiting for the next step. Devon's breath quickened, the injustice of it, all washing over him like a wave. "Why did you do this?" Devon's voice cracked as he approached the officer in charge, Officer Carl Denman, the one who had fired the shots. "Why the hell did you shoot him?" The officer's gaze remained steady, unreadable. "Step back, Sir," Denman said calmly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He barely even looked at Devon, his eyes darting around the scene like he had already moved on from the tragedy. "You need to stay behind the tape." Behind the tape, Devon's voice was sharp, rising with the fury that had been building inside him since the moment he saw his brother fall. "You shot my brother. He was unarmed. He was just walking home. What the hell did you think you were doing?" Denman didn't flinch. "It was a mistake, sir. We thought he was a suspect. You need to back up." His words were sterile, calculated. He gave Devon no room to grieve, no room to ask questions. He just wanted to move on. The anger swelled in Devon's chest. He had watched his brother fall. He had seen the life drain from Marcus's eyes, and yet here was this officer standing over him with the coldness of someone who had done nothing wrong. A mistake. That's all this was supposed to be. But Devon could feel it deep down in his bones. This wasn't just a mistake. This was murder. The police didn't care. They never did. Devon knew it, deep in his heart. The official narrative was already being formed. The police department had already begun to bury the truth. Within minutes, they were moving the crowds back, setting up barriers, cordoning off the area like it was just another routine incident. Devon turned to look at the yellow tape, the flashing lights, the officers who stood like sentinels, pretending that nothing unusual had happened. His brother's life meant nothing to them. It was just another incident, another black body, another statistic. And the system, the one that was supposed to protect them, had already closed ranks. Prepared to move on, Devon could feel the bile rising in his throat as he stepped away from the scene, his mind spinning with the cold realization that Marcus's death was already being erased. He could hear the murmurs in the crowd, people already talking about the robbery suspect description that had been broadcast earlier, the same vague, racially charged description they always used, young black male, medium build. But was it that was all it took to make Marcus a target? By the time Devon made it back to his home, the police department had already released their official statement. It was impersonal, it was quick. The language was cold, clinical, and oft. Shooting occurred after a suspect matched the description of a robbery suspect earlier reported. The suspect reached for his waistband, and the officer responded accordingly. That was it. No mention of Marcus's name. No mention of the fact that he was unarmed. No mention of the fact that he was a 17-year-old kid with a bright future ahead of him. Just a suspect, just a robbery, just an excuse for another death. Devon stared at the screen, the words blurring before his eyes as the reality of what had happened hit him all over again. This wasn't justice, this wasn't even an apology, this was a dismissal, a life extinguished, and they were already moving on. The DA's office, within hours, had made its stance clear. No charges would be filed, no investigation, no accountability. Devon's mind was reeling. It was as if his brother had never existed, as if his life had meant nothing. "I'm sorry for your loss," one of the reporters had said earlier that evening when they finally reached out to him. But the officer acted within his training. The words felt like daggers. Training. Devon couldn't believe what he was hearing. The weight of the police department's indifference settled over him like a suffocating blanket. Marcus's death was just another statistic, another chapter in the long history of black men who had been stolen by the system. But to Devon, it was personal. This wasn't just another case. This was his brother, his flesh and blood, the person he had vowed to protect, and yet, here he was, and the world had already moved on without so much as a second glance. The days following Marcus's death were a blur of disbelief, but underneath it all, a seething rage began to grow. The more he thought about the police department's response, the more the injustice of it all cut deeper. It wasn't just the shooting, it was the lack of accountability, the lack of humanity, the way the system had already moved to justify what had happened. Devon's grief turned to fury. It was a slow burn at first, a feeling in the pit of his stomach that gnawed at him, ate away at the hope he had held for so long. The world had failed Marcus, the world had failed him, and the anger grew, rising higher with every passing moment. The system had buried Marcus, but Devon wasn't going to let them bury the truth. He wasn't going to let them forget. It was time for Devon to act. No more waiting, no more pleading for justice. The system had failed his brother, and now it was time for him to take control. But this wasn't going to be a typical fight. This wasn't going to be a march or a protest. This wasn't going to be about asking for change. No, this was going to be a reckoning, and Devon Carter was going to make sure the world remembered his brother's name. He wasn't just going to get justice, he was going to make them pay. Days passed, but Devon remained stuck in a haze of disbelief. The world had moved on, but his grief was still sharp, raw, like a wound that would never close. He tried to distract himself, tried to go through the motions of life, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus lying on the street, blood pooling around his body. Every time he tried to shake it off, the image would come rushing back, clearer than before. The silence was what hurt the most. The silence from the public, the lack of outrage. People were talking, sure, but it was as if they were waiting for something, some answer that never came. The media covered the tragedy briefly, but the story was quickly buried. The same tired phrases filled the air. Another senseless death, another police officer just doing his job. It was the same pattern, same narrative, same excuse. Devon sat alone in his living room one evening, staring at the TV as the latest news report ran a segment about the police officer involved in Marcus's death, Officer Carl Denman. The report was brief, no details about the investigation, no real questioning of the officer's actions. Just another casual mention, glossing over the fact that Marcus had been unarmed. Just another attempt to normalize the tragedy. to push it into the category of business as usual. The words echoed in Devon's mind. Business as usual. That's what his brother's death had become, a statistic, a page in a report, a bullet point in a police department's quarterly briefing. But Devon couldn't let it go. His grief, which had been a dull ache at first, was slowly becoming sharper, more intense. The anger was building, a quiet fury that began to gnaw at him with each passing hour. He wanted to scream, to protest, to make the world see Marcus for who he truly was, a bright, promising kid with a future. But what good would that do? The system was already working against him. He could see it now. It was clear as day. The system was broken, it was corrupt, and nothing short of destruction would fix it. There was no justice coming. No one was going to stand up for Marcus. Not the police, not the media, not the courts, and Devon could feel it deep in his bones. The world was never going to give Marcus the justice he deserved. The realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. No more pleading, no more begging for justice. The rage started to simmer. It wasn't just anger at the officers, at Denman. It was rage at the system that had protected them, the system that had taken his brother's life and turned it into a statistic, the system that would continue to protect those who wore badges, no matter what they did. He thought back to his own life, to the years he had spent in the military. Devon had been a soldier, had followed orders, trusted in the structure of the system, believed in the principles he'd been taught. He had been part of something bigger, something that was supposed to protect people, to keep them safe. But now, looking back, Devon could see it for what it was, a lie. The same system he had trusted in had failed him, had failed Marcus, had failed his community. The realization that the justice system was designed to protect the corrupt, to shield the guilty, crushed him. Devon had never considered himself a revolutionary, never thought he would have to stand against the very system he had spent years supporting. But now, with Marcus gone, everything had changed. There was no going back. Devon's internal conflict churned in his gut. Did he protest? Did he march, hold up signs, chant slogans? Was that the way forward? No, that was a lie. He had seen enough of these protests to know how they ended. The news would cover them for a few days, a few weeks at best, and then the story would fade. The officers would get a slap on the wrist, and nothing would change. No, Devon wouldn't be part of that cycle. He wasn't going to beg for justice from people who didn't care. He would make his own justice. Devon started to do research. He spent hours in front of the computer, scrolling through public records, searching for anything he could find about the officers involved in Marcus's death. He started with Officer Denman, the man who had pulled the trigger. It didn't take long to find out that Denman had a history. He had been involved in multiple complaints about excessive force in the past, but nothing had ever stuck. Devon dug deeper, pulling up every piece of information he could find, court documents, old news articles, internal reports. Denman wasn't the only one. Devon found others, officers with records, officers who had been involved in questionable incidents. Some had even been sued for brutality, but each time, the department had closed ranks. Each time, the officer had been cleared. It was all coming together, the pieces falling into place like a sickening puzzle. This was a system designed to protect its own, and that's when it hit Devon. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This wasn't just about one officer who had killed his brother. This was about the system that had kept people like Marcus down for decades. The system that had crushed his brother's life with one single, senseless bullet. The system that had failed them both, over and over again. Devon could feel the change inside him. The anger had solidified into something else, a purpose. The more he dug, the more determined he became. He wasn't just doing this for Marcus anymore. He was doing it for every person the system had failed. For every black man, every black woman who had been murdered and forgotten, for every life that had been taken by officers who thought they were above the law. Devon's resolve was growing stronger. He wasn't going to sit back and watch the world move on. He wasn't going to let Marcus become just another name on a list. He was going to make the world remember his brother. And in doing so, he was going to bring the entire corrupt system to its knees. The house was still, silent, too quiet for Devon's liking. The usual hum of everyday life had evaporated, replaced by a weight he couldn't shake. It had been a week since Marcus's death, but the reality hadn't set in, not fully. His brother was gone, the world had moved on, but Devon couldn't. The first few days after the funeral had been a blur of numbness, of people offering their condolences and promises of justice. He'd ignored them all. It wasn't until he started digging into the police officers involved in Marcus's death that the anger began to solidify. At first, it was a flicker, a quiet fire that didn't have a name. But as he uncovered more, it became something deeper, something darker. The system was designed to protect the ones who wore badges, not the ones who died under them. Devon sat at his desk, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows over the room. He opened the folder he'd been compiling for days. Names, dates. Officer Carl Denman was at the top, the one who'd pulled the trigger. Below that, a list of every officer involved in Marcus's death, each one marked with a piece of information. A home address, a shift schedule, a record of past complaints. Devon had spent hours scouring public records, poring over news articles, reading through internal reports. His hands trembled slightly as he ran a finger across the paper. The officers' faces weren't unfamiliar to him anymore. He'd seen their names on the news, their photos on press releases, but now they were more than just faces in the media. They were targets. He knew exactly where they lived. He knew when they were off duty. He knew which stores they frequented, which routes they took to work, which coffee shops they stopped at in the mornings. He had spent hours tracking their routines, watching them, learning their patterns. He didn't trust anyone else to do it. He couldn't. Every move he made had to be precise. It had to be calculated. The police department had already moved on. They had already buried Marcus's name under their excuse, their sterile report of the shooting. They had already convinced the public that it was just another case of a black man reaching for his waistband. Devon wasn't just angry anymore. He was methodical, cold, and calm as he mapped out his next steps. This wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about sending a message. A message that the system could no longer protect its own. A message that the world would hear, no matter how much they tried to bury it. It had started with a small notebook, nothing fancy, but now it was filled with details. Devon had tracked the officers' movements for days. Every time one of them stepped out of the precinct, Devon had been there, watching. He had staked out their homes, taken notes on every little detail, the cars they drove, the way they walked, their habits. Nothing escaped him. He knew their weaknesses, knew how to slip past their defenses unnoticed. He'd learned how to be quiet, how to blend into the shadows. From his time in the military, he had trained for this. Not in the way he had expected. He'd never imagined he'd use the skills he'd acquired for something like this, but the discipline, the precision, it all came back to him. And now, those skills were going to be put to use. Devon wasn't a killer. He had never been a killer, but every time he thought of Marcus's smile, his laugh, the way he'd always dreamed of a future beyond the neighborhood, every time he thought of how the officers had murdered his brother, in cold blood, the rage fled again. The grief had transformed. It was no longer just sadness, no longer just a feeling of loss. It was anger pure and unrelenting. The first time Devon picked up a weapon, it felt foreign in his hands. It was an old rifle, a military-grade piece he had stored away, something he'd kept for self-defense after his time in the service. He hadn't touched it in years, but now, it felt necessary. He wiped the barrel down, checking it for any imperfections, ensuring it was ready. The weight of it in his hands felt like a burden, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but one that he now had to bear. Devon set the rifle down and picked up the next item, his phone. He was careful with the details. Everything had to be accounted for. He couldn't afford a slip-up. He couldn't afford to get caught. He had created alibis, made sure he had an airtight cover for the time he would be gone. No one could know what he was doing. The moment they found out, it would all be over. As he prepared, memories of Marcus came flooding back. He thought about the nights they had spent sitting on the porch, talking about the future. Marcus had always been the dreamer, the one who believed in something bigger than himself. They had shared so many dreams. Marcus had wanted to create programs for kids, build community centers, and give kids like him a chance to rise above their circumstances. He wanted to use technology to create opportunities where none existed. Devon had always believed in him. He had watched his brother work hard to secure scholarships, to stay on the right path despite everything working against him. Marcus was more than just his little brother. He was a symbol of what could be, of what should have been. And now, that was all gone. Devon clenched his jaw, pushing the memories back as he focused on his task. He had work to do. He had a mission. The plan was simple. First, he would go after the officers one by one. He would take them down silently without drawing attention. No mess, no mistakes. He would make sure they knew exactly why they were being targeted. They would understand the cost of taking Marcus's life. They would understand the price of protecting the system that had allowed it to happen. And then, when the last one fell, Devon would be ready. The message would be clear. But there was still one more thing to consider. The police department would come after him. They would make him the villain. They would turn him into a criminal, a terrorist. Devon had expected that he had already prepared for it. If they wanted a villain, he would give them one. But the truth was, he wasn't doing this for revenge. He wasn't doing this because he hated them. He was doing it because there was no other choice. The system had failed his brother, and now it was time for that system to feel the consequences. The night was still thick with the kind of silence that comes before something inevitable. Devon had spent days preparing, obsessing over the smallest details, waiting for the right moment. He had tracked Officer Carl Denman's routine to the letter, memorized his every movement, every stop, every time he went out for a coffee or took a walk around the block. Denman had become predictable, and Devon knew that's when the real danger started. When someone became predictable, it had been a week since Devon had made the decision. A week since he had decided he would no longer wait for the justice that would never come. And now, it was time. Denman was alone tonight. His car was parked in front of a nondescript building in the middle of nowhere, far from the lights, far from the eyes that might catch a glimpse of what was about to happen. Devon had been watching, from across the street, hidden in the shadows of a broken-down car parked just outside the streetlight's reach. His breath was even, controlled. He checked the time on his wrist, counted the seconds in his head. Denman always stayed a bit longer when he went inside, like clockwork. The moment he stepped out, Devon would make his move. It wasn't anger that pushed Devon forward. It wasn't blind rage, it was cold, calculated precision. This wasn't personal, at least not in the way people would think. This was a reckoning, a debt that needed to be paid. And it had to be done without hesitation, without mercy. Devon moved through the darkness like a shadow, the weight of the rifle in his hands barely registering. He had practiced with it countless times, learning its weight, its recoil, the way it would sound when it fired. The world around him seemed to disappear as his focus narrowed to just one thing, the target. Denman stepped out of the building, his shoulders slumped from a long day, unaware of the danger that waited just a few yards away. He reached for his car door, fumbling for the keys in his pocket. When the sound of Devon's footsteps, silent, deliberate, told him it was already too late, the shot rang out with a sharp crack that seemed to shatter the stillness of the night. Denman's body jerked as the bullet tore through his chest, a clean, deadly shot. His hand froze, inches from the door handle, and for a split second, he seemed to hover in the moment, suspended between life and death. And then, with a sickening thud, he collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground like a rag. Devon didn't move, not at first. He kept his eyes trained on the lifeless officer, watching as the blood began to pool beneath him, dark and spreading across the pavement. His breath was steady, even as his heart pounded in his chest. The first death had come, just like he had planned. He stayed hidden for a few more moments, just to make sure Denman wouldn't stir, wouldn't get up, wouldn't fight back. But there was nothing. The officer was dead, and Devon had left no trace. He was already moving before the first sirens wailed in the distance. He blended back into the shadows, becoming nothing more than a ghost. By the time the police arrived, Devon was miles away. Back in the small house he'd lived in with Marcus, the place where the life they had built together now felt like a distant memory. The scene was chaos. Officers swarmed the area, pushing back bystanders, shouting orders into radios. The usual protocol kicked into gear: secure the scene, cordon off the area, call in the investigators. But there was no sign of a struggle. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints. Nothing to tell them who had done this. As they stood over Den's lifeless body, confusion began to set in. Nothing about the scene made sense. A trained officer, taken down so easily with no warning. No fight. The shooter was skilled, too skilled. This wasn't a random act. This wasn't the work of a street criminal. Whoever did this had planned it, executed it with cold precision. The officers began to question each other, turning the scene into a frenzy of whispered theories. Had it been a hit? Was this some kind of gang retaliation? Or was it something more personal? They couldn't make sense of it, and that made them nervous. Within an hour, the police department was in full crisis mode. A few officers murmured that it was a targeted attack, a message to the force, but there was no concrete evidence. No one had seen the shooter, no one had heard anything until the gunshot. The higher-ups started to move quickly. A lockdown was issued for all precincts. All officers were told to be extra vigilant, stay in pairs, and avoid sticking to any predictable patterns. The department began circling the wagons, preparing for the fallout. But they were already too late. Devon watched it unfold from his living room window. He could hear the sirens in the distance, getting closer with every passing second. He didn't feel fear, not like he thought he would. Instead, there was a cold satisfaction that settled in his chest. The first part of the plan had been executed flawlessly, and the world, at least for tonight, would not forget his brothers. name, but the fear inside the police department was palpable. They couldn't understand who was doing this or why, and with each officer's death that followed, their confusion turned to panic. They didn't know who was targeting them, and that uncertainty gnawed at their nerves. The media was already buzzing with the first reports, asking questions they didn't have answers for, and the department, already on its heels, didn't know how to explain it. As Devon watched from the shadows, he realized how easy it had been. The system that had failed Marcus, that had dismissed his death as nothing more than a case of miscommunication, had not expected someone like him. No one had anticipated that Devon Carter, an ordinary man, a brother who had loved his family, would become their worst nightmare. Devon had become a shadow, a figure in the darkness, a legend in the making, and this was only the beginning. The death of Officer Denman had barely settled before the whispers started. At first they were nothing more than rumors. The streets where Marcus had grown up murmured of a shadow, a figure who had moved between life and death without leaving a trace. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, spreading from one corner of the city to another. They were no longer just rumors. They were the beginnings of something more, something much darker. The second officer to fall was Officer Mitchell Griggs. Unlike Denman, Griggs didn't live in the public eye. He was quiet, unremarkable, a man who blended into the background. The perfect target, perhaps, for someone like Devon the night Griggs was killed. Devon was already in position, having spent the previous week tracking the officer's routine. Griggs had been stationed near an industrial area, a place where the faint hum of machinery never seemed to stop, even in the dead of night. It was a perfect place for someone to slip in and out without being noticed. Devon had studied Griggs. For days, knew the exact moment when the officer would be alone, when his patrol car would be parked outside a convenience store, and when Griggs would take his usual break to grab a cup of coffee. It was then that Devon struck. The method was different this time. No gunshots, no bloodied streets. This was a quiet act of violence and execution that would leave no trace but a simple message. A message that the world was too quick to ignore. When Griggs entered the convenience store, Devon was already inside, slipping through the aisles like a shadow. He was careful, deliberate, as he approached the officer at the counter. The officer didn't notice him at first, too busy fumbling for change. But Devon's hand was already moving, steady and precise. A small, unobtrusive syringe slipped into Griggs's drink. The officer took a sip without a second thought, never suspecting the slow poison that would soon begin to course through his veins. Less than 20 minutes later, Griggs collapsed in the parking lot, clutching his chest as his breath became shallow. It wasn't immediate, but it was swift, an agonizing few moments before his body went limp, silent in the cold night air. Devon watched from the shadows, the figure of vengeance now becoming something more, a legend, a symbol of the justice that was being denied. No gunshots, no explosions, just a slow, calculated death. The third officer to die was different again. His name was Officer Lucas Hayes. He had been on the force for nearly a decade, a man with a reputation for pushing people around, for using his badge like a weapon. He was the kind of officer who made his presence known, who spoke loudly, laughed too much, and always stood in the front when things got tough. Devon knew Hayes' habits well. He'd watched him from a distance, studied the officer's movements. Hayes wasn't as careful as Griggs or Denman. He made himself too visible, too accessible, and that was exactly what made him the perfect target. This time, Devon used a different method, one that would send a message to anyone watching. He planted the bomb in the officer's car. It was a small device, easy to make, but deadly. When Hayes turned the ignition, the car exploded with the force of 1,000 thunderstorms, tearing through the parking lot with a deafening roar. Windows shattered 4 blocks, cars were flipped onto their sides, and debris rained down onto the street. Below. It wasn't chaos, though. It was calculated, a surgical strike that sent a clear message. No one is safe until justice is served. The police were already scrambling when the news hit. The media had caught on to the pattern, but no one dared to speak the truth, not publicly. Instead, they reported it like any other murder, unsolved, unconnected, an act of violence carried out by some random assailant. No one spoke Devon's name. No one mentioned the reason behind it. The officers who had died were just numbers now, casualties in a city plagued by violence. But the pattern was undeniable. The streets began to talk, and the whispers spread. Some called it retribution, some called it a war, and some called it justice. But no matter what they called it, the fear grew. The police department had been shaken to its core, and for the first time they didn't have control. They didn't know who was behind it, or why, or when the next strike would come. Behind closed doors, the police department went into crisis mode. Emergency meetings were held, strategies put in place to catch whoever was behind the killings. But for all their efforts, for all their resources, they were no closer to finding Devon. They were scrambling, and it showed. Officers were pulled off their regular patrols. Unmarked cars were put into rotation. The mayor held press conferences, urging the public to remain calm, to not give in to fear. But the city was already on edge. And Devon, he was invisible. He moved like a ghost, slipping between the cracks of a system that couldn't protect itself, let alone the people it was meant to serve. His movements were precise, deliberate. Every step he took was a calculated decision, and every death was part of the larger plan. As the fourth officer fell, panic began to set in. This time, it was Officer Samantha Reed, a young, ambitious officer who had only been on the force for 2 years. She was alone when she was attacked, in a parking garage after a late shift. Devon had watched her for days, learning her schedule. She was the weakest link, a rookie still eager to prove herself. She had no idea what she was walking into. The method was once again different. This time, it was a bulleter, clean shot to the head from across the street. No one saw Devon, no one heard the shot. But when Reed's body was discovered, slumped against the wall, the police knew something had changed. The pattern was unmistakable. The investigations were now in full swing. The department was on high alert, but the more they searched, the more they found nothing. No evidence, no leads, no suspects, and with each officer who died, the terror among the force grew. The whispers about the shadow became louder. Officers began to avoid certain areas, changed their routines, started to question each other. Trust among the department fractured. Every new death was another reminder that they were vulnerable, that they weren't untouchable. And the media, they continued to cover it like any other crime spree. Reports of the killings, interspersed with vague descriptions of a suspect. The press had no answers, only questions. Who is behind this? They asked. But Devon's name remained unspoken. But the community knew, and in the neighborhoods where Marcus had once run track and had his dreams, the name Devon became something else, a symbol, a force of retribution. The community whispered his name not with fear, but with reverence. They began to see him not as a criminal, but as someone who was doing what they couldn't, someone who had the courage to stand against a system that had failed them all. The police department was losing control. The city was starting to fracture. And through it all, Devon remained hidden, his name spoken only in whispers, the shadow. The figure who had become both a legend and a symbol of justice in a world that had abandoned him. Devon watched as the city pulsed beneath him, lights flickering from a distance like a heartbeat. The sound of sirens was a constant hum in the background now, a reminder of the growing chaos that had become their new reality. But Devon had stopped paying attention to the noise of the world around him. He was too focused, too calm, his mind locked in on the final act of his plan. Tonight, everything would come to a head. The police had been closing in on him, but they were still too far behind. Devon had seen the increasing number of officers patrolling the streets, the checkpoints they had set up, the suspicion in their eyes every time they passed someone who fit the description of the shadow, as they had begun to call him. But what they didn't realize was that they had already lost. They had no idea who he was, where he came from, or what he was capable of. Devon had stayed invisible, slipping through the cracks of their investigation with ease, his movements calculated and silent. He had watched them, studied them, and learned their every move. Now, it was his turn to strike. The final target was clear. It wasn't just any officer, it wasn't just a random figure to silence. This was the one who had started it, or the officer who had fired the first shot. Officer Carl Denman, the man who had taken Marcus's life. But Devon knew he had to do something more. Killing Denman wasn't enough. No, it wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It had never been about that. This was about sending a message to the system that had killed his brother and countless others like him. A system that had covered up Marcus's death with lies, with excuses, and with silence. A system that had failed them both. Devon knew that unless the whole system felt the weight of the loss, unless the people in charge understood that they couldn't keep hiding behind their badges, nothing would change. So, tonight, Devon wasn't just taking down an officer, he was bringing the entire corrupt system to its knees. That it was midnight when Devon made his move. The police chief's house was situated on a quiet street, the kind of neighborhood where the only sounds at night were the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the trees. It was far from the noise of the city, far from the chaos he had set into motion. The chief had lived here for years, in a large, well-maintained house that was nothing more than a symbol of his power. It was too perfect to clean a man who had been protected by the system he served. But not anymore. Devon had done his homework. He knew the layout of the house, the schedule of the chief's patrols, and the paths he usually took. He had watched from a distance for weeks. Every door, every window, every escape route had been mapped. Nothing was left to chance. Tonight, Devon wasn't just the shadow anymore, he was the storm. He moved swiftly through the darkness, his footsteps silent against the cool concrete. The chief's house loomed ahead, its lights dim but steady. Everything seemed so normal. But behind the walls of that house, a man who had protected his own was about to face the consequences of his actions. Devon reached the back of the house, the area shaded by a large oak tree, and crouched down. His rifle was in his hands, steady and familiar. He checked the time. The chief would be in bed by now. The front gate would be locked, the windows closed. But Devon had already thought of that. The house was large, and he knew where to go. He could get in and out without anyone noticing. He wasn't just a man with a plan. He was a ghost, a whisper in the wind. He climbed over the back fence and slipped into the yard, moving quickly, keeping to the shadows. There were no security cameras. The house was too old for that kind of tech. Devon had already taken care of everything else, the timing, the alibi, the clean getaway. This was it. He could feel it. The end of a long, bloody road. When he reached the side of the house, he pulled the window open. It was already unlocked. The chief was predictable, too comfortable in his position. Devon smiled bitterly. It was exactly the kind of mistake he was counting on. Inside, the house smelled of rich wood and expensive leather. There was no sign of life in the hallway. Devon moved silently, his feet brushing against the cool tiles, his heart beating in his chest with the rhythm of his purpose. His eyes scanned the darkness, and there, at the end of the hall, was the door he had been waiting for. The door to the chief's bedroom. Devon took a deep breath, steadying himself. His mind wasn't racing anymore. He had already made his decision, no more hesitation. He was a man on a mission, and he was prepared to see it through as he pushed. The door opened. The sight of the chief lying in bed, unaware of the danger creeping up on him, only fueled Devon's resolve. The room was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Devon aimed the rifle, took a deep breath, and pulled the trigger. The shot was clean, precise. The bullet tore through the air with a sickening crack, embedding itself deep into the chief's chest. The chief didn't even have a chance to move. His body convulsed once, then fell limp. His eyes never even opened. Devon didn't linger. He turned, slipping back through the door as he had come. The silence in the house was deafening, but Devon's heart was calm. He had done what needed to be done. The message had been sent. The next morning, the news would be all over the airwaves. Another officer dead, another mystery, another string of killings that no one could explain. The police would be in disarray, scrambling to find answers, but Devon was already gone. The police chief's death was just the beginning. And Devon, he had become something more than just a man. He had become the reckoning that the system had been too blind to see coming. The police were in disarray. No leads, no suspects, just the mounting body count of officers who had paid the price for Marcus's death and the system that allowed it to happen. The city was on edge. Every precinct and every street corner, now under constant surveillance. They were looking for him, hunting him down with everything they had. But Devon Carter had already slipped into the shadows. He had vanished. In the weeks following the final strike, the death of the police, Chief Devon had disappeared like a ghost. The authorities had tried everything. They'd brought in the FBI. They'd turned every corner, every alley, and every database upside down, desperate for a trace, for some hint of his whereabouts. But Devon had planned it all too perfectly. He was gone, leaving nothing behind but the echo of his actions and the legacy of his message. The media branded him a terrorist, a cold-blooded killer. They spun the narrative to fit their own narrative of fear, calling him everything they could to demonize the man who had taken down a system that had spent decades failing families like his. But as the weeks stretched into months, the media's power over the story began to wane. People didn't just see him as a killer. They saw him as something more. In the neighborhoods where Marcus had grown up, where Devon had spent his life trying to build something better, the story of the shadow began to take root. They started to call him a symbol, a hero even. Devon had become something larger than life. His name was whispered in the halls of schools, in churches, in barbershops. The whispers grew into stories. The stories became legends. He was no longer just a man. They saw him as a force, an unstoppable will that had confronted a broken system. Devon had become a myth. On the streets, murals began to appear, the first painted just days after the chief's death. His image, always shadowed and elusive, started to pop up on walls and street corners. The paintings were simple but powerful. Devon's face shrouded in darkness, only his eyes visible, staring out from the walls as if to say, "I am watching." His message had been clear from the start. You can't kill the truth. In one particularly striking mural, Devon was depicted standing next to Marcus, holding his brother's shoes, the very ones Marcus had worn the night he died. The words below read, "Justice for Marcus." The same words echoed in every protest, every gathering, and in every quiet conversation that unfolded late at night between people who had come to see Devon not as a villain, but as someone who had done what the law had failed to do. As the days turned into weeks, and then into months, the police still had no idea where he was. Devon had left no trail, no trace of his presence anywhere. He had become a ghost, and the legend of his actions only grew. There were stories of people seeing him in dark alleys, of a shadow moving swiftly in the corner of their vision, but nothing concrete. Devon had been prepared for this. He had erased every part of himself from the world. No digital footprint, no bank statements, no phone records. Devon had ensured that the system wouldn't catch him. He was invisible now, but despite the police's best efforts, the search for Devon Carter slowly began to fade from the public eye. It was as if, in their failure to find him, they had forgotten what had driven him to this. His actions had sparked something larger, something the city couldn't ignore. Slowly, the message Devon had sent began to sink in. The death of Marcus had been a tipping point, but the aftermath had sparked a movement. The city began to ask questions. The community began to demand answers. Protests started to grow in size, no longer just about Marcus's death, but about the systemic issues that had allowed it to happen. Activists who had once been marginalized now found their voices amplified. The protests spread, not just in Atlanta, but across the country. Devon's name was still whispered in every march, every rally, every act of defiance against the powers that be. And in the midst of all this, Devon remained gone. No one knew where he was. There were no sightings, no clues, but the story had shifted. The manhunt continued, but the focus had changed. The message was clearer now. This wasn't just about one death. It was about the countless lives taken by a broken system that refused to change. One night, as the world seemed to pause at the edge of a new, uncertain chapter, a single note appeared on the steps of the local police station. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Devon. The note was simple, the words scrawled across a torn piece of notebook paper, the ink faded but still legible. "For Marcus, and for every other one of us they've forgotten." The message hit harder than any bullet, resonating deeply within the community. It wasn't a call for revenge anymore. It was a demand for change. Devon had made it clear, his fight wasn't just for Marcus, it was for everyone who had been failed by the very system that claimed to protect them. That Devon Carter had become a myth, but his story wasn't over. It lived on in the hearts of those who had been silenced, in the streets where his name was shouted, in the eyes of the young people who now saw the system for what it truly was. They knew they could no longer wait for justice. Like Devon, they would take matters into their own hands. And though the police would continue their search, and the media would continue to call him a criminal, the truth was that Devon Carter had already won. He had brought attention to what had been ignored for far too long, and no matter how hard they tried to erase his name, the world would never forget. Devon Carter had become the change that was needed.